This is the Business Stuff Podcast. This is where I will share the lessons I've learned from advising thousands of businesses over almost 30 years. Each episode will give you practical insight to allow you to learn from other people's mistakes. I'll be pulling in experts from our team and the world of business, and together we'll make sure your business is giving you what you want. My name is Martin, and this is the Business Stuff Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Business Stuff. I'm Jack, and I'm joined not by one but two people today. Very lucky. So first of all, we've got Emma back from RL Wealth. Lovely to see you again.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't scare you off after your first one.
No, not yet. We'll see how today's podcast goes.
Well, I know that you insisted that I did it rather than Martin, and that's why.
Yes.
Yeah, that's obviously the reason. We're also joined by Rebecca Cresswell from Sweeney Miller
Hi.
Solicitors, I should add, before people go, Sweeney Miller, who are they?
Yes.
So yeah, give us obviously law's a big area, and especially when we're talking about business, and you're in an area where people may go, what's this got to do with business? And it's family law, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
So just, do you mind telling us a little bit kind of what stuff you do kind of within the sort of family law space?
Yeah, so I predominantly deal with financial settlement on divorce. So that can include businesses dealing with those, pensions, any savings, assets and property issues. I also deal with just divorce, because divorce and separation can be different depending on whether you're married or unmarried. And also you can just deal with the divorce yourself, or we can deal with it, and then you also have to deal with the financial settlement.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's lots of elements to a divorce. Something
Yes.
I'm not familiar with, thank God. I've only been married for a year, so I haven't done anything too wrong. Fingers crossed, yes.
Yeah,
Well, the joke's on here, there's not a lot to take at the moment. So yeah, you've kind of touched on this, obviously a very complex area with a lot of things to think about, and I suppose there's a lot of places where things can go wrong. So, I mean, have you got any experience, obviously without naming any names or clients or anything, but like in terms of like, what kind of negative experiences have you seen when people basically aren't prepared for this sort of stuff?
Well, it varies really if somebody is married or not married. So the law is very different in those circumstances. A lot of people think that there is a thing as a common law marriage, and that's not the case. So if people aren't married, the law is different for them and they don't have as many rights. Mm-hmm. So they won't, for example, have any entitlement to company shares if they were to separate. Of course, you can deal with that in a company commercial contract if, for example, you want your partner to have shares in your company, or if they are an employee, then you would expect an employment contract. But if for example, you want to really secure that, you might want to have a cohabitation agreement, and that could cover any finances that you have. And when you come to separate, that's already in the cohabitation agreement, so you're fully prepared for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. It's interesting that, isn't it, when people have been together for an awfully long time and they just assume they've worked together, they share, home together, a life together, that everything will just pass across, and it just doesn't work like that, does it?
That's right.
It's true, and it's a case of very much. It's like a normal business in a lot of sense, in the terms of like you may have a business partner, and a lot of times you just kind of have that implicit level of trust. But ultimately, there's more on the line when you're kind of doing this sort of family agreement, even if it's kind of a husband and wife or civil partners or whatever. Mm-hmm. Getting into business, there's that extra layer of jeopardy where stuff can go wrong.
Definitely.
And I suppose like a lot of businesses that we certainly deal with, and possibly what you deal with as well, is that they don't necessarily have that protection in place, do they? Like they don't have a shareholders agreement because they don't really think anything's going to go wrong.
That's right. It's so important to have something in place to protect your assets. Yeah. Also, I mean, it's the same if you are married. We would recommend a prenuptial agreement, mm-hmm. because then if, for example, you do separate, you already have that in place, and there's no added stress when you do come to separate. Mm-hmm. And you do have that clarity when you are together, and you can think of things logically rather than when you have separated and people aren't always as logical because there's the emotional side of it as well.
Totally. Yeah, and it's very similar in that sense that you can only really draft these things when you're getting on well, and that's the same in any business, but especially when you've got that additional layer of a divorce, which is just can be really difficult, can't it?
Yes, definitely.
Totally. So, I mean, that's certainly one level of things where stuff can go wrong. But even when we talk about, some people don't fully understand how exposed they can be, even when they're kind of through the process of going through a divorce. I think you've got some examples of when things are being scuppered at the last minute by, unforeseen circumstances.
Yes, I've had a situation where a married couple were in the process of gathering financial information which we would exchange to reach a financial settlement, and before we got to that point my client actually died, and thankfully we had already severed the tenancy agreement, which is the way a property would be held with the land registry. So luckily it was held as tenants in common in equal shares, so that would pass automatically to my client's family members rather than the former wife.
Yeah, and that's where things like shareholder protection come in and become really important, to make sure if anything happens to either partner or director of the business, that the business itself or the other remaining directors have the funds available to buy out the deceased person's share, because ultimately it means there could be somebody from outside of that unit now has, a 50% shareholding in a business and knows nothing about the business, and it's about, the other shareholders actually having that money available to buy the share, allow them to benefit from that estate, and so that everyone's okay, really.
Yeah, it is certainly the case, and people don't really kind of appreciate that as well. It's something that it's a difficult conversation to have, isn't it? About talking about worst case scenarios, about what happens if we get divorced, what happens if I die, that's the main reason why a lot of this stuff isn't in place, because it just requires having that.
I think
really
people automatically assume that kind of cover is expensive as well, and it's actually not. And the earlier and younger that you put that into place, actually the cheaper it is. And it's, for a set period of time, for a set term, right up until retirement, that you've got that financial security of the business being able to continue as it is if the worst happens to either party or member.
And I suppose going back to your example there, Rebecca, is that ultimately if they had been better planned, then they would have avoided that scenario, because there wouldn't have been that kind of long drawn out process of trying to pull together a financial settlement. It would just be the case of, right, okay, this is what we've already drawn up and let's action it, and therefore these unfortunate circumstances like people dying aren't going to happen halfway through the process.
That's right.
Sorry.
We also offer fixed fees for prenuptial agreements as well, so a lot of people think that they don't want to spend the money on protecting their assets, but when you think of how much they might have in a property, for example, or a pension, it could be vast compared to the small legal fees that are actually incurred.
Yeah, and everyone has a very strange idea of what prenups are, because they've got this kind of Hollywood idea of them, and therefore on the silver screen they're kind of seen as these terrible things that are used by unscrupulous people, but that's not really the case though, is it?
That's right. Anyone can have a prenuptial agreement or even a postnuptial agreement. Yeah.
It's about being realistic, isn't it? It's not about wealth, it's actually just about protection and self-preservation of your share, if you like, isn't it? And what's the right thing pre-marriage or post-marriage in terms of people benefiting from the hard work that they've put into a business over the years.
It's about that certainty as well of knowing what's going to happen. And people like certainty most of the time.
Especially where businesses are involved.
Well, yes, of course.
There's enough uncertainty to do with businesses at the moment. So I think just solving one of those potential things is really important. So I suppose it's implicit in what we said so far is like the timing of this is so important. I mean, ideally people should have this stuff in place, but when is the second best time to be doing this sort of stuff?
I would recommend you should try and have a prenuptial agreement at least 12 months before you intend on marrying, because we would have to deal with financial disclosure. It's the same as what you would do if you were separating. You need to provide that disclosure to your future spouse to show what you actually have and how you intend on sharing that if you are to separate. If, for example, you haven't had that time frame to consider everything and you want to do it after you've married, then we would recommend doing it as soon as possible.
Just on like a side question here, in terms of like, this may be applicable for a business, maybe not, but if you're putting some money into a property, for example, how much protection do you get through kind of the conveyancing process in terms of if someone puts more money in than the other? Is there kind of protection built in there, or is that something else that needs to be considered separately?
Yes, so the best way to protect that asset is to have a declaration of trust. That would be within the title deeds. So you can either have a percentage to one person, for example, if they've paid more into that property, then you would want to protect that deposit. But if you're both contributing equally and you are going to continue, then that would be fine as it is. But if you also want to protect how much you're contributing to bills, or if you're going to pay the mortgage, then you might want to consider a cohabitation agreement alongside the title deeds, and then you know exactly what entails a separation if it came to that.
I don't know if it's probably too late in the podcast to be asking going back to very simple questions, but what kind of, if we can kind of like almost provide a glossary of what the different terminology is. So like, what's different to a cohabitation agreement against like a prenuptial, against a financial settlement?
Yeah.
Just for the layman. I mean, obviously I know all of these things, and I will not be taking notes.
So a cohabitation agreement is for unmarried couples if they live together. You can also include anything with businesses in that cohabitation agreement. A lot of people choose not to get married now, and you still need that financial protection because you haven't got the automatic right that you do when you're married. So I think that's really important, and not a lot of many people actually do that. And then you've got the pre or post nuptial agreement. That's for people who are going to be married shortly, or they've just been married. So that protects them if they were to separate, and then we look at the financial disclosure for that. And also the cohabitation agreement, we can include assets that they might have, whether it's property, cars, anything like that you can include. And then if, was it the consent order, did you ask? Or?
I didn't, but yeah, well, let's follow that up as well, yeah.
So if you were to divorce, you need a financial settlement, which we would prepare into a consent order or a clean break order. So a lot of people read online there's clean break orders, but that would be if there was no further financial tie to the spouse. But some situations there may be an ongoing tie. For example, if there's children involved, you might have an ongoing payment to pay for the children's expenses. You might also have spousal payments to the ex-spouse. For example, if I find, unfortunately, it's still a lot of women that would give up their career to care for children, and they then have less income because of that, and they also have less pension because of that, because they haven't contributed as much as the husband usually.
That's what we found out in a lot of work that we've been doing recently. It's financial planning to find financial fairness in divorce. So it's about splitting assets, not necessarily 50-50, but actually what is fair and what is fair to them, and based on, you know, the length of time they've been married, based on one partner's, you know, ability to accrue more pension in future than the other one, at what age pension benefits can be drawn, and how all of their assets, the home, cash, investments, pensions, can be split so that it is a fair divorce, rather than it just being, you know, what somebody believes they're entitled to. It's not necessarily about that.
You're so right as well, and there's so much intangible stuff within a marriage that you can't almost value, and or certainly cannot be appreciated, hence why you're probably at the point where you're divorcing anyway. But there's certainly like these intangibles where it's so hard to come to a fair settlement, because in that scenario, one person's generally bringing in the money, the other one staying at home, and but that's suggesting that the finance is more important than what's happening at home, which isn't the case, really.
Well, that's it, and
We're
it's
getting into kind of moral questions here. Now we're getting into ethical.
It's about seeking advice, I think, before you go down that route, having a real true understanding of what assets and resources you have and what they can provide you with in terms of what the future looks like for both parties before you will have these conversations daily before you have to fight through a court to actually, have that split.
Totally, yeah. So basically the answer to the original question I think I asked was, if you haven't got anything sorted now, or haven't done it already, then it's something you need to really start thinking about as soon as possible, essentially.
Yes, definitely. If, for example, some people have done the divorces themselves because the law changed this year in April, so it's a non-fault divorce now, which means that as long as you can prove that there's an irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, then you can get divorced, rather than listing the grounds that were previously there, like adultery, or a period of separation for 2-5 years, things like that. That no longer applies. So a lot of people are doing the divorces themselves, a DIY divorce, and they aren't then thinking about the financial settlement. So if someone hasn't done that, then really you should think about it as soon as possible, because there's no timeline on when you can have a financial claim against the other person. So, I mean, I've had people come to me before and they've been divorced for 10 years, but they haven't finalised the financial settlement, and we have to deal with it then. And they may have had an increase of earnings, or the very rare occasion someone might have won the lottery, and that would all be taken into account, and they would have far greater assets than what they did 10 years
had
ago.
they just done it at the time and done it properly.
Yes.
That's interesting, because there's someone I know who, again, divorced maybe 3-4 years ago, and everything hadn't arranged the financial settlement, and only at the point where they were buying a new house with their new partner did this suddenly become an issue, because they had issues around selling their original family, like marital home, and then as a result they almost lost the house that they were buying, because they had to suddenly hash out this financial settlement at the very last minute. Luckily it all worked out in the end, but obviously it's another example where it can come back to bite you if it's not sorted at the time, if you don't get the right advice at the right time. So I think we've kind of covered off a lot of stuff. We've touched on a lot of stuff, but if somebody was watching now and going, right, okay, I'm thinking about setting up a business, I've been working, I'm going to go freelance now, I'm going to set up a limited company or whatever, what steps do I need to ensure that I'm protecting myself, and also, I suppose I'm making this sound like I'm trying to screw another person over here, but how can you best protect yourself or provide that fairness? Maybe let's go down that route. How can we provide a fair and equitable structure for someone?
It depends if you're already married or not.
So let's cover both scenarios then.
Yes.
If they're not married.
If they're not married, then you should really have a commercial contract drawn up to set out any shareholdings within that company. If that is your partner, then you need to get advice on how that's going to be affected if you were to separate, and whether you would want that person to continue working for the company if they have an involvement in that. And you do find some couples are quite happy to continue with the business the way it's running, because they're both making a profit or an income from that. But quite often you do find that people just find that they can't work together anymore. So you need to think about how you are going to separate that business.
And is this when kind of protection also comes in as well?
It is. I was going to say, in terms of the protection and financial protection in case of a death or a critical illness, it's really from the outset that you need to consider the shareholder protection, maybe even something like a key person insurance, which, if there were two partners, one of them dealt with a specific area of the business, and if anything was to happen to that person, sales would fall, it would actually impact the future of the business. A key man policy or a key person policy would, provide a lump sum of money to the business to ensure that they could either recruit to replace that person, or just keep that business ticking over, maybe until the other partner was able to train themselves to do what, the deceased was able to do. So I think Shareholder protection is a given, to make sure that there's money there to buy out a deceased spouse if you wouldn't want them to, you know, take on that shareholding and be part of that business. And equally, key person insurance is just as important.
Absolutely. And does the advice, what's the advice, how does that advice differ based on them being married? Does that require something completely different, or?
So that could be in the prenuptial agreement. Really, you would want to consider the same eventualities if you were to separate, but you also have to consider that if you do separate when you are married, then any income would be considered in the settlement, so it is open to be shared. And then if you do need to consider the capital value of the business as well, then we would need to look to get the business valued. So that can be done by the accountants who usually work with the business already because they already know the business really well. But you can then have problems where the other spouse, they might not trust their spouse anymore, and we might need independent valuations, which the court can order if we think it's necessary. So there's a lot of things to consider, but it's always good to have something in place like the prenuptial agreement where you have a business already. You can have some non-marital asset, which could be the business that was already there before you were married. So you might want to get that valued at that point, so that if you do separate, you can look at how much the business was valued before you were even married.
So that's where you've either got an established business already before you got married, or perhaps you've got a stake in a larger family business, for example.
Yes. Excuse me. With family businesses, usually it would be quite rare to separate them unless there's a need of the parties. So the court would look at whether each spouse needs anything else to move forward with their life and separate. So if you do have a family business, then it's quite difficult to sometimes determine who's done what, and people have different roles, and then sometimes you have spouses that help out in the business, but it might not be an employee, so we'd have to look at that really carefully to determine if there is any interest from the spouse with that business.
It just goes to show you the importance of doing these things in the beginning and not at the end, because you know there's so much more to fight over, if you like, whereas in the beginning it would be very straightforward. This is what we're going to agree to, we're both happy with that, let's sign that and move on and move forward with our lives. But that's the difficulty after the event, isn't it?
Totally. And it kind of raises on maybe a little side topic there in terms of, like, we've talked a lot about kind of spouses in terms of their separations. If we did look at like a family business in its own right, in terms of like two brothers or brother and sister or uncle and niece or whatever, like what do they need? Is there anything that they can do to kind of protect themselves in that scenario? Because obviously nuptial, like pre or post nuptial agreements aren't going to wash with them. We're not in Alabama after all, so.
I mean, we'd have to again look at how that company was held and the shareholdings within the company to advise on that.
But that's even messier, particularly when you're dealing with multi-generational, like or fourth generation businesses, where it can get really messy.
It is, absolutely. And one thing that's just sprung to mind when you said that there is that the number of companies who are family run, who are brothers all of different ages, that don't necessarily have an exit strategy. I know I've gone off piste with that a bit there, but it just sprung to mind because somebody will be about to hit retirement and want to leave, and then they haven't actually considered how that person is going to be remunerated for that. So that, I mean, that's probably a podcast for another day.
No, it's so true, and it does tie back to the family law in the sense of it's still, they need to be having those conversations about succession planning, about shareholders agreements for those scenarios where one of them dies or is incapacitated. Having like a shareholders agreement that will kind of show the methodology behind what will happen after that.
I think businesses that pass down through families as well, they just keep going as they've always done, haven't they? I think the people who go into business now as a brand new startup, they have more, there's more advice available to them. It's more known about the things that they've got to consider. But I think when it just hands down through families, people just push everything to the side, don't they? So
it's always worked that way. It'll continue to work that way.
Well, I think it's the beauty of, you know, financial advice, accountancy and legal advice, of us getting the word out there in terms of what's important and what you need to consider, as, you know, from the start.
I mean, imagine if a client came in right now, they would be horrified, like the trifecta. Like, oh God, what have I done? I've done something wrong.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think we've kind of covered everything we wanted to talk about. It's been relatively painless for your first time on a podcast.
Yes.
So
Thanks for having me.
That's quite all right. But yeah, I mean, I hope you found that really useful. There's a lot of stuff that we touched on there around, you know, family law and business, and there's possibly some things you need to go and think about. And obviously, Rebecca's available to discuss anything. Emma likewise on the protection side.
Yeah.
I'm just here to look pretty, so don't get in touch with me about this sort of stuff. But I really hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.